Welcome to the Path to the Pier. This tour explores the remarkable history of sites along the route of the University of St Andrews' traditional pier walk, sharing historic photographs from the university archives and digital reconstructions created by the Open Virtual Worlds team and their spin-out company, Smart History. The pier walk is one of many unique traditions at the Scottish University of St Andrews. On Sundays, after chapel, students process from the town centre down to the harbour, then walk along the old pier wearing their bright red gowns. The origins of the tradition are uncertain, but the walk may commemorate John Honey, who in 1800 single-handedly rescued 5 men from drowning. The path to the pier goes past many of St Andrews' historic sites and links together different aspects of the borough's past, including learning, faith, trade, and the sea. It is a walk through history. The pier walk begins at St Salvator's Chapel, where university services are held during term time. The medieval chapel forms the south side of the United College quadrangle, which today lies at the heart of the modern university. The site has been a place of learning since the 1450s, when Bishop Kennedy established a college here, dedicated to Christ the Saviour. Fragments of the medieval college survive. Both the tall tower which looms over North Street and the beautiful college chapel would perhaps have been recognisable to medieval students. But the rest of the quad has changed dramatically. The medieval college site was far more enclosed and built up than the wide open lawns we see today. Immediately to the north of the chapel, there was a square cloister, which lasted into the 18th century. When Daniel Defoe visited St Salvatos in the 1720s, he described the buildings as very magnificent, and the cloister as, after the ancient manner, not unlike that in Canterbury, but not so large. On the western side of the college, where now there are lawns and flower beds, stood the medieval college hall. This survived into Victorian times, but was demolished as it was felt to be outdated and in poor repair. Before the building was torn down, it was photographed by David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, two of the pioneers of British photography, and a reminder of St Andrews' involvement in many innovations in Scottish life. After gathering in St Salvator's, the students on the pier walk progressed down North Street, one of St Andrews' 3 main medieval thoroughfares. The walk then turns left onto what we now call North Castle Street, but was known in the Middle Ages as Fishergate. The road leads towards the remains of St Andrews Castle, once the residence of the bishops of St Andrews. This was both a fortress and a palace. Pre-Reformation accounts and inventories record tapestries, velvet cushions, a lavishly furnished chapel, and seeds imported for the garden. Yet this was also a place of power and violence. Political and religious dissenters were imprisoned in the castle, and in 1546 the Protestant preacher George Wishart was burnt as a heretic outside its gates. A few weeks after Wishart's death, the French sympathising Archbishop of St Andrews, Cardinal David Beaton, was murdered by Protestant activists. After killing the cardinal, the assassins strung his body from the cardinal's walls, then proceeded to occupy the castle for over a year. The cardinal's killers were eventually removed by a fleet sent from France. John Knox was one of the Protestants in St Andrew's Castle at this time. He later described the final days of the siege before surrender to the French.
Upon the penultimate day of June appeared in the sight of the castle of St Andrews 21 French galleys, with the skeef of an army, the like whereof was never seen in that firth before. The next day, after that the galleys arrived, they summoned the house, which being denied, they prepared for siege. And first they began to assault by sea, and shot 2 days. But thereof they neither got advantage nor honour, for they danged the slates off houses, but neither slew man, nor did harm to any wall. But the castle handled them so that Sancta Barbara, the gunner's goddess, helped them nothing, for they lost many of their rowers, men chained in the galleys, and some soldiers, both by sea and land. And further, a galley that approached nigher than the rest was so dung with the cannon and other ordnance that she was stopped under water, and so almost drowned, and so had been were it not that the rest gave her succour in time, and drew her first to the west sands, without the shot of the castle, and thereafter to Dundee, where they remained, till that the governor, who was then at the siege of Langhope, came unto them, with the rest of the French faction.
Following the siege of 1546 to 1547, St Andrew's Castle was repaired and continued to be occupied into the 17th century. However, it gradually fell into decay, and masonry from the castle was removed to repair the pier in the 1650s. Coastal erosion did further damage, and the eastern section of the castle, including the Great Hall, fell into the sea. The survival of the castle as we see it today was made possible by reinforcement of the cliffs on which it stands. After passing the castle, the pier walk winds its way along the top of the cliffs down to St Andrew's Cathedral. This was one of the largest buildings in Scotland, praised by the medieval writer Walter Baer as the lady and mistress of the whole kingdom. St Andrews has been an important religious centre since at least the 8th century AD. At an early date, the churchmen of St Andrews acquired what they believed were bones from the body of Jesus' disciple Andrew, who later became the patron saint of Scotland. The remains of the Great Cathedral that we see today were largely built between the 12th and 14th centuries. What was then known as the New Cathedral was consecrated in 1318 in the presence of King Robert the Bruce. Further repairs and remodeling of the cathedral buildings took place at the beginning of the 15th century. Walter Bauer, who was then a novice at the cathedral, later recalled the improvements made by Prior James Bissett.
He completed the nave of the great church properly, and likewise the cloister, in all respects with rafters and roof covering. He renewed the choir tastefully with stalls, and the cloister quadrangle with both roofing and paving. He also restored the whole monastery and each of its domestic buildings, with alterations and new buildings, along with granaries, mills, malt kilns, piggeries, barns and byres. Some of these were new buildings, with others it was a matter of covering and roofing. Likewise also the guest hall, which he constructed in an appropriate style, with columns and glazed windows with its 2 apartments. The courtyard also of the whole monastery, both at the lower level and outside, he pleasingly constructed and finished with stone paving. He refurbished at a good standard all the churches attached to his office, and whichever others were annexed to the monastery, as regards the buildings and the ecclesiastical vestments.
For many generations, St Andrew's Cathedral was at the heart of Scottish national life. And in 1538, it was the scene for wedding festivities for Mary Queen of Scots' parents, James V, and his bride, Mary of Guise. Yet just over 20 years later, religious changes in Scotland would transform the purpose and appearance of this remarkable building. In the summer of 1559, Protestant activists, objecting to perceived corruption in the Catholic Church, sacked the cathedral. A great bonfire was made of its furnishings. Statues and altars were smashed, and within a few decades, the great church had fallen into ruins. By the 1620s, the unusually named writer Habakkuk Bissett regretfully commented on the old ruinous walls of the cathedral. Before descending to the harbour, Pier walkers pass another fragment of St Andrew's religious history, the foundations of the Church of St Mary on the Rock. During the late Middle Ages, this was a royal chapel, served by a community of priests. It was demolished at the Reformation, and the foundations uncovered again during the 19th century. Excavations in this area in the 1980s revealed that the site has much longer history than previously recognised, with prehistoric burials dating back to about 500 BC. Perhaps this site was chosen as a burial place by early peoples because of the remarkable views over the North Sea. St Andrews is a place where land and sea come together, and nowhere is this more apparent than the harbour, the culmination of the Pier Walk. For centuries, the harbour was the gateway between St Andrews and the world. In the Middle Ages, shipping travelled to Scandinavia, Germany, Flanders and France, taking overseas Scottish exports such as wool and salt, and importing luxury goods such as silk, alabaster statues, and valuable books. The small size of St Andrews Harbour meant that as ships grew larger, it became less suitable as a major port. Indeed, St Andrews Bay was often hazardous to shipping, as the story of John Honey reminds us. In January 1800, Honey was worshipping at St Salvator's chapel when news arrived that a ship had run aground. Efforts were made to save the crew, but in the stormy weather they failed. John Honey then swam out with a rope to the ship and successfully rescued all the 5 men on board, in a remarkable example of courage and selflessness. During the 19th century, St Andrews Harbour was increasingly devoted to fishing. It also acquired an industrial edge, with gasworks located just below the walls of the cathedral. The harbour today is still a working port, and fishing boats bringing crab and lobster. The northern edge of the harbour is protected by the pier, which the students walk along on Sundays. There's been a pier on this site since the Middle Ages. Originally constructed of wood, the pier was gradually rebuilt with stone taken from the ruins of other St Andrew's buildings. In 1900, a concrete extension was added to the pier, producing the long structure we see today. The pier is in many ways like St Andrew's itself, a mix of old and new built up over the centuries. A structure which has seen adversity but still endures, and we hope will survive for many future generations.
That was such an impressive and such an interesting tour to get of St Andrews and St Andrews history down to the pier. I'm just wondering, how did you manage to put all of that together, Bess?
Well, I think it came from a lot of different sources. I think first and foremost, I should praise my colleague Sarah Kennedy from the Open Virtual Worlds team, who modelled the digital reconstructions as part of the wider research group and also who put together a lot of the visuals there. It's also, of course, rooted in historical research that's been going on at the university for some time. My own background was in 16th century Scottish history, and I've looked at the Reformation in St Andrews. We're also fortunate to have had some amazing research done over the years by Special Collections, who shared a number of the images here. And also, of course, there's things like Michael Brown and Katie Stevenson's recent volume, Medieval St Andrews Church Cult City. So we're very fortunate in all the research that's taking place in St Andrews, which fed into this tour and our reconstructions, notably including also the work of Richard Fawcett as well, from Art History, who informed a lot of the work on the cathedral. Alan, I mean, this work has come out of the Open Virtual Worlds group. And could you tell us how the team started working on things like sort of reconstructing St Andrew's Cathedral, and can you tell us a bit about sort of the wider work of the group?
I was really impressed just looking back at that, actually, of the video of St Salvator's chapel, and the what we do is we take all of this historical and archaeological information and kind of distill it down into visuals and models, which is represented in the reconstruction of St Salvator's. But I think it's amazing to think back that we've been doing this. We started doing this with Rebecca Sweetman, Professor Rebecca Sweetman, in the School of Classics, with a reconstruction of Spartan Basilica. A good 15 years ago, we started doing that in 2006, and I think that what we've really tried to do is we've tried to do interdisciplinary work, working with classics and history and archaeology, but also working with museums and archaeologists kind of in the outside world, putting technology to work in being able to represent history and represent the past in ways that are, accessible and engaging to people. And I think we've managed to kind of, like, over the years, had a big impact in pushing it forward in terms of using the digital in museums, using digital as part of heritage and engaging people.
It's going to be taken forward yet again, isn't it? There's been some recent releases, in fact, relating to St Andrew's history, so things like the Market Street project. But there's other things coming out and that are still being worked on to do with representing St Andrew's past.
We've been doing a lot of work with St Andrew's Preservation Trust, and we've been really pleased to be working with them on the Harbour project, doing digital reconstruction of the harbour as it was in 1921. And also we are doing quite a lot in European projects all the way around the globe, actually. But back at home, in terms of St Andrews, watch this space, because we're going to be releasing a reconstruction of the whole of St Andrews as it would have been in the 16th century.
It's very, very exciting for people to explore St Andrew's past and present. And we hope that people will soon be able to visit St Andrew's in person once again.